Hello and welcome to this discussion of the world in 2020, the impact of COVID-19 on geopolitics and economics. Our particular focus today is on the Middle East and North Africa, and I have two brilliant experts with me here to talk about all of this. One from the perspective of the GCC, Scott Livermore from Oxford Economics, and the other from the OECD, Arthur Minsat, who's going to talk particularly about North Africa. And the two sub-regions, if you like, within the region have very different perspectives, very different angles that they take on a lot of the issues that we're going to discuss today. I'm really looking forward to an exciting discussion, not least because we've seen everything over the last few months. We've seen volatility, we've seen oil price collapses, we've seen geopolitical crises, we've seen a new US regime potentially elected over the last week. Everything in the region looks like it's uncertain at the moment. And so we have to start with that biggest issue of all, in economic terms anyway, which is the dependency of the region on oil. Now, one of the factors during the whole COVID crisis was the collapse in oil prices back in February, end of February, beginning of March. It was almost before the COVID crisis started to take effect on global economies. And it's had a particularly severe effect on the Middle East. And Scott, what's your view on all of that? Do you think it's going to be COVID, or do you think it'll be the collapse in oil prices that will have the longer term effect on the region?
Yes, thank you, Rebecca. I think your summary is exactly right. In the region here, we've been hit by the double whammy of COVID and a drop in oil prices, and both have hit the economies really hard. You're right to say that the GCC economies aren't that diversified yet, although we have made progress. But I don't think that dependency on oil, or being less dependent on oil, would have insulated the economy anymore. Economies around the world uniformly have been hit really hard. I think where you see an impact and where you maybe see an acceleration of policy is it's given a jolt to governments around their dependency on oil revenues. You've seen in a number of countries expenditures cut, be it Dubai, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Oman. You've seen taxes rise. We've seen Saudi Arabia increase VAT from 5 to 15%. We've seen discussion of income tax in Oman, and personal income tax is always thought as pretty no-no out here. So there are changes, and that's going to come to the fore. And I think there'll be a continued long-term push to accelerate the diversification of government revenues or their access to funding. And you see that in three ways. Firstly, they will continue to tap markets, debt markets, especially while they can borrow cheaply. That already happened pre-crisis, and it's continuing, especially those with good credit ratings. We've touched upon diversification, and I've given examples of Saudi Arabia and Oman. I'd be astounded if the other countries in the Gulf aren't currently discussing how to raise taxes from the non-oil sector, whether it's VAT, excise, corporate income tax, or personal income tax. And finally, the spending cuts are likely to be permanent. The governments are going to rein in current spending, especially around the rentier state where nationals are employed in comfortable jobs. That's all likely to change, if only gradually. And of course, there's going to be an impact on development programs, which will be much more focused and maybe slightly less gung-ho than they would have been if oil prices were significantly higher.
So, I mean, just to focus on that for a little while, the IMF for some time has been quite negative about the region, and it's not just recently. It's been for a couple of years, and I think a lot of that has been around the lack of speed with which new reform processes have gone through. How different is it this time, do you think?
Well, I think there's an awakening. I think there's a reform will and there's a vision from the leaders. One of the issues we have here in the GCC is they like to think big reforms, big projects, giga projects, and they're all important for kickstarting the economy, but especially the more advanced in the diversification, the UAE, but also elsewhere, they need to think small. They need to help the SMEs of the world access to credit. All the massive tech companies around the world, which every GCC government would like to have here, they started as SMEs, and there would have been a load of similar SMEs that failed in order to generate these mammoth companies. And we don't quite have that environment here that kind of complements the big vision and enabling the entrepreneurs to take risks, to make bets, sensible bets, and to do that without a fear of failure. And I think that would be critical for pushing the development agenda.
I think those are all really well made points. I mean, Arthur, the North Africa region is different, isn't it? It has, I mean, it's still dependent on oil. It's still very commodities dependent, but it has, it also has a stronger manufacturing base, for example, in Morocco. So, what are the differences in terms of oil dependency? Is it? I mean, are you seeing big differences in that part of the region?
Yes, there are two main types of countries in the North Africa region. First, you have the oil-dependent countries, especially Algeria and Libya, who are the 18th and 21st oil producers in the world, and who are not diversified. 95% of the exports are just one product, oil. And the other countries, although also natural resource dependent, are more diversified. As you rightly highlighted, Morocco, for instance, has been a key exporter in some products, from textile to farming products like the lemon, where they have been able to add value in the production chain. But let's mention also Tunisia, that is very dependent on tourism, and that has been particularly hit by the crisis because of tourism, but also of the slowdown in remittances. And also Egypt, which is the most diversified economy in the region and the biggest economy on the African continent. And we estimate that for Egypt, which is particularly dependent on tourism, 2/3 of the loss caused by the crisis will come from the tourism sector, which accounts for about 12% of Egypt's GDP. So we see different types of impact on the region. And we can also mention that the exposure to trade with Europe, but also to the Middle Eastern region, is particularly high. All the North African countries have more than 50% of their trade with the European continent. So how the growth will be able to bounce back will depend on the trade and investment linkages with the Middle East, but also with Europe. And here, strategies from countries such as Morocco for industrialization, for instance, will have to see how the recovery is going to take place in the different regions of the world. We see today that Asia seems, according to the official statistics, Asia seems to be bouncing back quicker than the other regions. And therefore, countries like Egypt, who have more exposure to Asian countries, for instance, could benefit from that. And whereas countries like Morocco and Tunisia, although they are quite diversified, could suffer from the deeper trade and investment linkages that they have with the European region, depending on the speed of the recovery in Europe.
So you're still painting a picture of a lot of dependency. So dependency on Europe, dependency on Asia, and that is, in a way, a symptom of an emerging region, of course, but also a very heavy dependency on oil. Now, one of the things that you have talked about, which is interesting because it affects the GCC countries as well, is the dependency on tourism. Now, that's surely been very badly hit by the COVID crisis. That's been something that it's been hit worldwide. So presumably, the North Africa region has been hit by that as well.
Absolutely. And one key, so to diversify the economies, so tourism could be one way of going forward, although it will depend on on open sky and on the ability to fly in tourists from the world or from the regions. But there's a second very big opportunity for the region that is untapped. It's a regional integration. Regional integration has been particularly low. There's very little trade between the North African countries, whereas they could have different comparative advantages. So there are big opportunity for those countries to specialize in different parts of trade and add and generate regional value chains into which that can benefit for enhancing productivity, Productivity growth has been very low in the region and could be enhanced further, also to create jobs. And this is where government strategies have tried to make a difference. If we mention Egypt's diversification strategy or the plan for Morocco for the industrialization by 2030 with a vision 2030, are ways to move forward as we have in other parts of the Middle East. With the Abu Dhabi 2030 vision, for instance. So I would say regional integration is a big opportunity there that has been untapped. And hopefully, as Scott highlighted, we're going to see new political momentum in the region, but that will depend on many factors: elections, the political will, and the capacity of governments to work together and to implement policies.
So I think let's focus for a minute on the African Union and the perspective for the African continent free trade area, and that has now been agreed by a large number of countries, not all of them by any manner of means. It's not got off the ground quite as quickly as we thought it was going to, but there is a huge amount of effort going behind it. Now Scott, to go back to you and the big projects that the GCC like to do, is this an opportunity actually for the GCC to start getting involved with big infrastructure projects across Africa? Because one of the big barriers from the work that I've done suggests that it's actually that intra-African trade that is the real opportunity for growth. We're starting to see it increase, but at a very low level, and it's still only around 17% of the regions of the GCC plus North Africa, only around 17% of total trade. So it's very low. Is it something that the GCC supports, this whole area, trading with one trade bloc effectively?
I think, to be honest, I wouldn't say the GCC views Africa as a priority now. I think it sees strategic opportunities there. It will look to build relationships and particularly look for spheres of influence. Clearly, in terms of developmental perspective and infrastructure projects, the active players are going to be the Chinese, and I don't think the GCC necessarily feels the need to reach out, and its focus and its attempts to reach beyond kind of its perimeter are somewhat limited. Infrastructure is going to be critical, clearly, but most of that infrastructure spending, even in countries like UAE, where infrastructure is good and there's been extensive spending, is going to be focused domestically, and building whether it's the cities, as they call them, which is kind of focused industrial areas in a particular area, whether it's tourism hubs, whether it's transport network, whether it's rail across the GCC. The infrastructure spending and the impact on the economy is going to be probably much more domestically focused, with not too much attention turned to Africa.
Do you think on all of that, the role of the Chinese is going to change? I mean, I've looked at some numbers from the Global Investment Tracker. It's a US organisation that tracks Chinese investment across the world. And if you look at the numbers for 2018 and 2019, both Africa and GCC have suffered actually quite a lot from a drop in Chinese investment across the region. Do you think, either of you actually, perhaps Arthur first, do you see that as a challenge for the region if China becomes less engaged? Because obviously COVID has affected the levels of money that China is capable of investing now in the Belt and Road Initiative.
Yes, but at the same time, a lot of money was also earmarked before, and capital is also a long-term, such as through the China Investment Bank and the Belt and Road policy, which means that I believe the momentum for investment in infrastructure will continue. And it will especially continue that there is political momentum behind it. From China, of course, but the leadership is with the African countries. And let's mention that in February, the African Union Summit, we launched its new 10-year strategy for the program for infrastructure development in Africa, but we're going to see quite a lot of change. In the past, there's been little success with the development of large infrastructure projects because there were too many projects and with not enough money to fund it. Now we see that there's a lot more money available, but also the plan is, instead of having 500 large projects, the plan is to have only 50 projects, so 10 times less, 5 per regions that will be decided by the heads of state. So there will be some political bargaining there, but at least there will be a good balance between the 5 African regions to develop infrastructure there, with a priority likely on development corridors, meaning in large cross-country infrastructure projects that can benefit the continental free trade area. And this is because the continental free trade area is actually Africa's biggest recovery plan now, and especially because of the COVID. So there will be there will be big impetus there to move ahead as soon as the picture is clearer from the pandemic side. The second point on China is that it's been, I believe, a big win for African countries in the sense that they have been able to diversify their investment base. And China has played a particularly important role there on the ability to build infrastructure much quicker than, let's say, the traditional donors have been able to do. And so we are starting some thinking at the OECD, together with the African Center for Economic Transformation, with the leadership of Ghana, on how to compress the time to develop large infrastructure projects with good governance and with good standards and for quality infrastructure. So if you take the case in Africa, where the population doubles every 25 years, China is able to develop large infrastructure projects in about 5 to 10 years, whereas for the typical projects, it could take up to 40 years. So there is a need here to change the scale and the way of doing things to ensure that African people have access to quality infrastructure, but that this is done in much quicker. And this is why working together with with global partners of Africa, but with the leadership of African governments and African institutions is key for that recovery.
So Scott, are we seeing those are really important points that Arthur's making about the energy actually across the continent and the absolute determination to come together as a region in a bloc and understand that the barriers and the difficulties are common. Are we seeing the same sort of thing across the GCC? I feel like it's more fragmented for all sorts of geopolitical reasons that we'll come on to, but maybe I'm missing something. Maybe there is more in terms of a cohesive sense of unity across the region.
I think we have the GCC, which is by its definition what we're talking about for Africa. So in terms, the umbrella should be there, and they were moving together, policies were moving together, they're allowing movement of trade and people more easily within the region. Clearly, we've had the blockade for the last few years where the UAE, Saudi, Egypt and others are blockading Qatar, which has a schism within the GCC and then means it works much less as an effective unit. But clearly there still remains close relationships between entities. The UAE and Saudi have strong relationships. Bahrain's under Saudi's wing. But there's much less of progress in a formal architecture or formal framework to take forward the kind of integration you and Arthur have been talking about.
So I want to dwell on that blockade of Qatar, because 3 years ago it was quite a thing. I mean, people were saying, oh, is this a collapse of the GCC? Is it something that's going to fundamentally alter the trade flows across the region, with Qatar looking potentially towards Russia and China to a greater extent than towards trading with its neighbours? Has it actually had that much effect? What has been the effect on trade, on economic development, do you think? Has there been a major impact? It's gone very quiet, but it's still there.
You're right, it's gone very quiet. I've been in the region for 18 months, so the blockade's always been there. And as a relatively new person to the region, I don't really know why it happened, which is just a signal of how much it's talked about locally, how much it's in the press. It's just something that exists at the moment, and if you want to go to the Qatar from Dubai, you have to go via Oman. It's kind of that inconvenience. I think outside of Qatar, the impact's been much less noticeable. Clearly within Qatar, the first couple of years were difficult. Their supply chains disrupted, tourism flows were obviously cut back because they had a lot of visitors from other GCC countries. But to be honest, they learned to live with it pretty quickly. So they identified different supply chains, they developed domestic capabilities. And I think even in Qatar, the impact of it now is felt a lot less than, say, it was 2 years ago.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because one of the things that we picked up straight away from it was that Qatar immediately started to start talking actually to, it stopped being neutral in the way that it had been, and it started looking to other parts of the region. So it started looking to Iran, Russia, China, and beyond the GCC. So it started to have a more diversified approach to its trading partners, if you like. And I want to come back to that point because, I mean, geopolitics is kind of baked into the region, isn't it? It's kind of, you take it not necessarily for granted, but it's something that doesn't actually make the region as volatile as everybody thinks it is, because we know it's there. So what are going to be the long-term recovery prospects before we really get into the geopolitical aspects of all of this and the sectors like technology that are going to drive this forward? What are the prospects for recovery quickly, do you think? Quick answer.
A quick answer. The GCC is quite ambitious. UAE just released a budget that says it wants to be one of the fastest recovering economies in the world. I think that's unlikely. I think it's a challenge. And you say that for a number of factors. Firstly, oil production is not going to recover anytime soon. The OPEC plus production quotas aren't going to rise. So that's going to be a limit. The non-oil sector is very dependent on travel and tourism and medium to long haul. And that's unlikely to recover to 2024. So that'd be a drag on the non-oil economy. When you lose your job in the Middle East or in the GCC and you're an expat, the expectation is you go back to your home country. And by some estimates, the UAE could lose 10% of its population during the crisis, 5% in Saudi. And that's a chunk that limits its responsiveness, limits demand, and makes it difficult to recover quickly. And finally, and I have more of a question mark about this one still, is fiscal support. Partly oil, partly principle. GCC governments haven't spent much money, 1 to 2% of GDP to support the economy through COVID, compared to 10% plus for the US, UK, Singapore, Korea. And it's known if you don't support the economy during a crisis, such as a pandemic, you have a scorched earth syndrome and it's hard to recover. And there is a risk that's where we are. Clearly, I hold back because there's little the government can do to support the economy in the eye of the storm, and it may be keeping its powder dry to actively support the recovery and the new sectors rather than prop up the old sectors. But that's something we're going to have to watch.
It's interesting, isn't it, Arthur? What are your sentiments for Africa and North Africa in particular? What's your thinking about recovery in the region? Does it stand a better chance because there's more of this focus on regional integration and growth?
I think a lot is in the air at the moment. It's very difficult to say. The first thing is the pandemic. It's difficult to assess to what extent it has an impact in the region. We see that more than half of the mortality and rates of COVID-19 on the African continent come from only one country, which is South Africa, so at the other extreme of the African continent. For North African countries, the data is reliable, but as we know, there's a lot of uncertainty with regards to global statistics if we compare China to Germany or the US or other countries. So it's difficult to say to what extent the young population on the African continent, it will continue to be less hit than the rest of the world. The second point is that it's very likely that most of the shock will come through economic challenges, and that the economic shock is going to be even much harder than the shock on the health front, which means that we are likely to see that decreases in incomes, in livelihoods for people, particularly those in the informal sector, that remains very strong and large in the North African region. We can recall the Arab Spring came from the informal sector largely. So that is another going to be a source of impact and also an uncertainty. And that means that the developmental challenge, as far as we look at education performance, productivity growth, the health sector in general, the situation remains very uncertain. And it's likely that the progress we've seen in the last decades could be reversed in just this year or in the coming years if the situation does not improve. So much of this will depend on the ability to cope with the crisis, come up with so I think the lockdown measures, while they can be disputed, they have done a very positive effect on the health sector, as we've seen globally. And the countries in North Africa have had the benefit of learning from what happened in other countries, and I would also say mistakes in other countries to have to better respond to the crisis. Secondly, we've seen very large plans in some countries like Egypt, like Morocco, for instance, where we have the financing for the recovery in Morocco. It's about $13 billion, 11% of GDP. So it's very, very substantial. And it's likely, hopefully, to continue depending on the ability of the countries to negotiate on debt and the ability to repay that debt. It's also likely that the fiscal reforms that Scott mentioned in the beginning, fiscal reforms will need to continue. However, I would say countries will need to rather focus on tax compliance, for instance, rather than just increasing the tax base, because that would offset counter fiscal policies, pro-cyclical fiscal policies. So there will be a need for the sequencing of policies going forward. But the uncertainty, I would say, in the region is also for the countries that are largely dependent on oil, Libya with a security situation, and with Algeria that is also going through a democratic transition, making the governance of policy reforms even more difficult. So there's going to be uncertainty on that front, and distinguishing between countries will be important for the region.
So I think there's, if I'm going to summarize where we've got to so far with the discussion, I'd say we've got several things. I mean, like everything, it's impossible to generalize. Africa is 54 countries, 55 countries, and the GCC is a collection of countries with different geopolitical bases. It's very difficult to generalize about how the economies are going to develop, and you've got some countries which are oil dependent and some which aren't. But there is a huge amount of dependency on the performance of other countries and other regions. So, for example, in GCC, you've got trade as the big factor, trade through the region, travel and tourism, and then commodities. Same in Sub-Saharan and in North Africa as well. So we've got a general climate of global uncertainty, which puts any recovery on I think you're both saying on a longer term time frame, very dependent on fiscal reform. What about the role of technology? So everywhere else around the world, we talk about digitization, and we talk about digital trade finance, and we talk about technology as a way of enabling economic development. And I remember donkeys years ago having a conversation with someone in Kenya who said to me, well, actually what's going to happen is we're just going to skip a stage of development. We're going to go straight to internet, straight to telephone, straight to digital technologies, and so we're not going to have all of that sort of messy industrialization in the middle. What role does digitization play? Arthur, you first.
Sure. So digitalization has a very big role to play. So I mentioned further CFTA as part of a potential recovery plan, but digitalization will be very big, and it has a lot of impetus with the COVID crisis. And there are big opportunities on the continent, on the African continent and North African countries in particular. If we look at the rate of progression of digital technology, it's been one of the fastest in the world. And the African continent has about 300 million mobile banking accounts, mainly in East Africa, but they've been spreading quickly over the different regions, which is more than 300 million banking accounts, which is more than all over the world, the developing countries put together. Of course, this is because it's difficult for people in the informal sector to open normal bank accounts. But as you rightly said, Rebecca, it shows the capacity to leapfrog and to jump hurdles and bottlenecks to the economy and to economic growth through technologies to leapfrog to new stages of development. And North Africa is particularly well placed here. 67% of the population in North Africa has access to a mobile network, 66% to the 4G technology, and 48.2% has access to the internet. It also, automatization poses, of course, challenges for job creation by making redundant some work with the less value added, but it also brings big potential for new job creation. We estimate that the mobile ecosystem in North Africa creates about 390,000 jobs directly, 650,000 jobs indirectly, bringing the total of more than 1 million together. So there are good opportunities. Of course, it's not enough to create jobs for the overall population of North Africa, but it can create a substantial amount of jobs and through different channels. One channel is the potential of the e-commerce. E-commerce has grown by 6.2% between 2005 and 2017. So it's quite substantial on an annual basis, and it's likely to continue to increase. A second big potential is the emergence of data centers and the tech clusters. There are very large clusters in North Africa, in Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia. Some are also appearing in Algeria or in Mauritania or in Sudan, for instance. So there are opportunities there. We can see 3 points on which governments can really make a difference. The first one is by improving access to a better and more affordable data. And this can be done by working with a strong multiplier effect on the spatial channel. So looking at the urban-rural divide. If we look at the statistics, we have 54% of the population in urban areas has access to internet in North Africa compared to 35.7% in the rural areas. And if we compare the role of intermediary cities, only 22% of intermediary cities have access to a backbone network compared to 56% for the large cities. So there could be a good multiplier effect by investing better in these intermediary cities that can provide an interface between the rural areas and the larger cities that have an easier access to the internet, thereby creating jobs. A second channel.
Maybe we can move on because we've only got 7 minutes, and I want to talk about geopolitics, and I want to talk about. I want to allow the audience to have a few time for some questions as well. And it's deeply fascinating because technology itself has become politicized, hasn't it? I mean, all of the stuff around Huawei and 5G networks and everything has become deeply political. Scott, the US election, I have to say this right now because we haven't talked about it so far and we keep promising. US election, is it going to change attitudes towards tech across the region? I noticed last time I was in the UAE, you had Huawei absolutely everywhere. Is it going to be different now that there's a different mantra, a more multilateral mantra in the White House, or is it actually going to be business as usual? We're still going to see this conflict. And what are the implications of the US election for the region? And while you're answering that, I'll take questions coming in from the audience as well. We can only take a couple, unfortunately.
Okay, quickly in response to your first question, will President Biden or President-elect Biden change the policy in the GCC towards Chinese tech? I think the simple answer is no. If they were still open in times of President Trump, when there's been a lot more political pressure, that's not going to change when you have a more multilateralist president. And we've got our own systems here, which kind of controls the technology and the implications of technology. In terms of what does it mean for the geopolitics of the region, if you look at the big issues that affect the GCC or what the GCC care about, Israel, Yemen, the blockade. I don't think it's really going to change policy much there. The biggest change is likely to be with the US's stance to Iran. And perhaps the simplest way to summarize it is the US was likely to become more European in its dealings with Iran and engage to prevent proliferation rather than take a really firm line. Clearly, that's going to cause some concern within the region, particularly in Saudi Arabia, who are clearly concerned about the relationship between their leadership and President-elect Biden. But I don't think there's likely, as I say, wholesale change, some nervousness, but that's likely to be smoothed over in the first few months of the presidency.
What about sanctions? Because if you look at Europe, and we have a question coming through about the dependency between the Middle East and North Africa and Europe in terms of trade. We were beginning to see European trade with Iran pick up. It's very important for countries like Germany. Do you feel as though there's likely to be a softening of the sanctions regime, or do you feel like that's here to stay?
I think there will be a softening. I think even if we don't go all the way back to the GPCOA, we're going to move in that direction. There's going to be incentives for Iran rather than just stick to prevent development of its nuclear capabilities. And that will create opportunities, both for the Europeans, but also you've got to remember the UAE lost out a lot by not being able to trade with Iran and how a lot of the trade went that way. And it's going to be hopefully a much more multilateral, as you've mentioned, and constructive engagement of Iran to try and achieve the ultimate policy goals.
So do you think, Arthur, the strategy towards promoting trade in Europe and with Europe by the US, which President-elect Biden has stated is one of his priorities to restore that relationship with the EU, do you think that will have knock-on effects in North Africa? Because you've said Europe is incredibly important.
It remains to be seen. It's a very good question. I don't have the answer between how the US and the EU trade is going to impact North Africa directly, because we don't know how it's going to be reshaped by the new president. However, we know that the Brexit, with the Brexit, we have a good counter example of a country leaving the EU to try to diversify its trade linkages. And until now, we have seen little impact from the Brexit on the trade with the African or North African countries. And so, again, it remains to be seen in the context of COVID. But I would say there is a lot of inertia in the trade linkages. So it's, I would say in the short term, it's unlikely to change much. And I don't think that the trade with the United States is important enough, apart from the trade in commodities. It's important enough to replace the trade with Europe. But I think there's more diversification is going to come with the trade with other Middle Eastern countries and with Asia in particular, or with other emerging countries in the East, like Turkey, for instance. There's been a large investor. Of course, these are smaller investors if we look at them as single units compared to the United States. But taken together, they are moving fast, and the rate of progress is going to continue to be fast, I believe. So in the long haul, I think that we could see substantial change there in the structure of the trade linkages. Can I come back to the question on the digital aspects and the geopolitics of it?
We have 1 minute.
Okay. So here, Europe is going to play a big role. They are a large provider of aid to the North African countries. The European Union has designed a strategy with Africa on digitalization. So it's likely to be implemented effectively in the future. So Europe could be another actor apart from China and the United States or Britain there, or Russia, for sake. The second point is the providers having the leaders of digital infrastructure everywhere, particularly in the continent. And if we look at where they come from, it's easy to understand where the impetus is going to come from. So Huawei, China, clearly, NTM from South Africa, Orange from France, or Vodafone as well. So these are the biggest players on the continent, and I think the importance is going to continue, and much will depend on how national regulation is shaped and how competition law is going to be shaped by the North African countries.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, both of you. We've run out of time, but that was a really exhilarating session. Thank you very much indeed.